Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to the Lake George Historical Association, located in the Institute of History, Arts, and Sciences on Connecticut Street in Lake George. Tonight we have Lyn Hohmann, Dr. Lyn Hohmann. She's a retired physician, and she began her interest in history with her father. Lyn was the president of the Lake George Battlefield Alliance, and she was instrumental in the visitor center. And if you haven't been to the visitor center, it's over on the Fort George Road off the beach road, and you really must see it. It's amazing. And Lyn also curated that as well. She is an avocational archaeologist, and she's currently working on the Cortlandt Street project here in Lake George, in the village. So please welcome Lyn and enjoy. Thank you.
I'm glad to be able to give you this talk about the forts of Lake George Battlefield Park. It's really kind of came out of, I went to the annual meeting of the association, and they're kind of saying, yeah, no, we need another speaker. They said, yeah, do you think you could talk? I said, well, maybe I could talk about the forts. Okay, here you are, August 13th, your date. So I kind of go, oh, that was fast. So here I am. Now, this is the first time I've given this talk, and I thought I knew a lot until I started doing the research for this story here. And I've learned a lot, and I hope to share it with you, and I hope you find it as enjoyable as I did in putting it together. So, I'm going to talk about Lake George first of all. Lake George started 10 to 12,000 years ago when the glaciers left, and it formed a lake. And the indigenous people were here at that time. This was their lake also, before Europeans came. And they used this lake the same way we did. They used it for transportation. They used it for food. I'm sure they went swimming in it and had it for recreation also. So from the very beginning, it was a very important resource for man to use. Now, why the south end of Lake George were 3 forts built? What was so important? Well, if you look at this map of New York State, you can look that from, I don't know if my thing will work here. No, okay. From New York City, Albany, Saratoga, Glens Falls, Fort Edward, you can go by water all that distance. You got to go portage around a couple of falls. You get to Fort Edward, okay, you got a portage of about 20 miles. You can either go to Lake George, you can go to Lake Champlain. Go to Lake Champlain, you're all the way to Canada. You go to Lake George, and then a short portage again into Lake Champlain. When you don't have a major highway and you need to get between New York City and Canada, if you're fighting a war or a trader, the water is the way to go. And that was the importance of Lake George. That was the importance of the south end of Lake George, and why it became so strategic during the several colonial wars. So I'm going to talk about 3 forts in Lake George Battlefield Park. I'm going to talk about the Stockaded Fort of 1758, the Stockaded Fort of 1759, and Fort George, and Fort George in 1759. So let's talk about that first one. Major General Abercrombie's Stockaded Fort and Hospital. It was built after the disaster in Ticonderoga. So if you all know about Abercrombie, he took his 8,000 troops, he went up, he was going to beat Montcalm, Montcalm beat him, he suffered a tremendous disaster, came back down to the south end of the lake. Built a stockaded fort, built a whole entrenchment around the camp because they were afraid the French were going to come back down. Now there is some historians, a good friend of mine, in fact, who said the stockaded fort was built in the beginning. In the notes it says there were 2 picketed forts built as Abercrombie was setting up the camp. He said one of them is the stockaded fort. But another source, and the source that I tend to really like to read, said that Abercrombie did not plan to come back. He planned to hit Fort Carillon, Crown Point, and continue north. So he wasn't going to build a whole lot of stuff down here. He was just going to go north. So we think his stockaded, the two picketed forts, one was on the old site of Fort William Henry, but the other one was probably on the other end of what is now the beach. And what they were sort of preventive defensive in the fact they could see the French coming down, because that's the way they were going. They didn't need much behind them. They needed to go that way. So I don't think this stockaded fort was built before Abercrombie left, even though you read some people saying it was. So the stockaded fort was, only building was a hospital. And remember, they just had this awful battle, and they had a lot of injured people, so they needed a hospital for the people. It was built as part of the retrenchments around the camp to protect against a French attack. Remember, they just got their butts beat by the French, and they were afraid the French were going to come back down Lake George and get them again when they were in this very weakened state. At the end of the season, and I'll show you how short that season was, it was destroyed. It was, quote, knocked over. And this was, if you remember the sunken bateaus in 1758, the sunken boats, all the boats, the radeau that's still out in the middle of the lake, they sank things. They sank everything. They took a lot of cannon down to Albany. They also buried the cannon, and they buried all the fittings to the sloops, were all buried. They knocked the fort down. Now, to me, that's very interesting, because I know where the stockaded fort was, and I'll show you in a little bit. I think this stockaded fort was built with horizontal logs. It wasn't a stockaded fort where everything was in upright position for two reasons. One, if you've ever been where the stockaded fort is, there is very little dirt. It's all rock. And if you're going to dig a vertical stockade, you need dirt. There ain't no dirt there to dig. So that's one reason. But the other is they threw this thing up fast. It didn't have to be there a long time. They just had to throw it up because they needed a place to put the hospital to be safe. It's a horizontal. Horizontal is fast to put up, doesn't last long, it's not very defensive, it's not very strong, but you can get it up fast. So I really think the stockaded fort, similar to Fort George, and I talked to Paul Huey about this. Dr. Huey was a state archaeologist, and I said, why do you build them this way? He says, they go up fast. They're not strong, but they go up fast. He needed a fast fort. And there's different stories. When they knocked it down, and I'll show you the dates, I've got some references. There are stories that they burned everything, or they didn't burn everything, they buried some and all that. I'll show you what I found in the record. Come on. Here we go. There we go. So here is Brigadier Major Alexander Moneypenny orderly book from those years. To me, if you're going to read about history, I really strongly go to diaries, go to orderly books. They have detail in there you're just not going to find anyplace else. Now, I have a deuce of a time reading them, but fortunately some of them have been translated. So on July 17th, he writes, to the regulars, another to General Lyman, another to Colonel Pebble, to mark out the breastwork to be thrown up before the respective corps. This was after they returned from Fort Carillon. So we have the record of it going up, July 17th. Here's Archibald Fuller, again, a diary. And when you read some of this, don't try to make them spell right. Read it phonetically. Thursday, ye 13th, we tarried there and was ordered to work upon the hill where the old breastwork was to level it in order to build a fort. Men worked very dull. So this was before the order came out to build the fort, but they were leveling the old breastwork. Well, the old breastwork was the entrenchments from 1757 when the French came down and destroyed Fort William Henry. There were entrenched forces up on the park, and that's what they were leveling. So they're building a fort. The fort wasn't there. That makes it seem very much likely that the two picketed forts were actually down in the beach area. So Saturday, we removed there. The building of the fort was put on by the, I'm not sure what he meant. The breastwork continued building. we was building a storehouse and a hospital and finishing the breastwork. So there they were telling about how they were building the fort, the breastwork, and the hospital and storehouse. Oops. And here is the entrenchments they were building. There's our fort, the stockaded post, and a hospital. And that's what they were building in 1758 after Abercrombie lost the Battle of Carillon. Here's Reverend John Cleveland, their encampment. Ours was pitched upon the ground where Colonel Titcomb was killed, and began to cast up a breastwork with an entrenchment against each respective regiment. Again, the story of what was going on. So there's a lot of sources that talk about it in that period of time after July 17th. Oops. So this is a blow-up of a map. Wonderful drawing. This is a Ratzner map, and here is the stockaded fort, and there's the hospital, an L-shaped hospital in it. So that's what they built. There's the hospital again. I believe the logs were put parallel to the ground. They were not vertical. So here we are, Tuesday, October 24th. So how many months are we from July? July, August, September, October. 4 months later, they're knocking it all down. And here they are, the breastwork in front of the regulars to be thrown down. Now, if you're going to throw something down, it's not like pulling something up and throwing it down. You're pushing it down. So there we are, I think, again, the idea of the vertical logs being pushed down. And here, all huts the same day. This is the Money Penny. All huts to be thrown down this evening and tomorrow morning, but none to be burned on any account. So that makes me think that they were saving these logs. You know how long it takes to cut a tree down? And think of all the trees they were cutting down. And they're just going to burn it? Now, these people weren't fools. My family used to say, Ma Carey raised no fools. Well, they raised no fools in colonial days either. So I'm sure that they buried them, stacked them, pushed them aside, but I doubt they burned all these logs because they knew they were coming back. And why would you burn something when you know you're going to need those resources when you come back? So that's the stockaded fort, 1758, all of 4 months. Up, horizontal, I believe, pushed down, left, when the army withdrew down to Albany. So here was General Amherst's stockaded fort in 1759, the next version. And he had 2 forts. Here's the stockaded fort. Here's Fort George. We'll talk about that later. You notice the shape is the same as the stockaded fort from 1758. And now in it, you see in that picture at least 2 long buildings. Well, fortunately, we know what that fort looked like. We have a picture of it. This is the stockaded fort, and what do you see? Horizontal logs. Horizontal logs on a stone base. I suspect they used the logs from the previous year. Can't prove it, but I suspect they used the logs from the previous year. So that's what the stockaded fort in 1759 looked like. On the same blueprint, on the same ground print as the one in 58. Makes sense. That's a blow up of it. Same thing, same shape. But now we've got the two buildings. And I want to point something out in this picture because I'm going to come back to it later when I show you the archaeology. This building here, which we call the officers' barracks from the digs, is right on the wall. It's right on the wall of the fort. That to me is significant in an archaeological find that we had. This is called the soldiers' barracks. It's for the men, the officers' barracks. Outside of it, there were 2 other barracks. C is barracks. There were 2 other barracks, and D is a hospital. Now, there are several other hospital buildings, but in this cutout that I did, I captured only one of them. And this is where the archaeological work was being done this summer And we were discussing whether she had the wall of this barrack or whether she had something related to the hospital. So it's, this is the fun stuff of archaeology, is what do I really have? We'll see. So the stockaded fort was started by Lieutenant Colonel William Eyre on June 28, 1759. Now, if you all know this Eyre gentleman, he was actually the only British soldier at the Battle of Lake George. He'd been in this area a long time. He was the only British soldier at the Battle of Lake George. That's how we know that, and he wasn't killed, obviously, because here he is. So we know that all the soldiers who fought and won in the Battle of Lake George were actually American colonists, American militia, which is kind of a little feather in our cap that that battle was actually won by Americans. Captain Eyre also was, at that time, his captain was very lucky in that he was supposed to go with Braddock. Now, you all know what happened to Braddock. Braddock's expedition to Pittsburgh was a disaster, and many people were killed, including Braddock. But he was sent up here to be with Johnson for Lake George expedition, actually the Crown Point expedition. A very lucky man, except that when he went back to England, I would love to have his diary. But when he went back to England, he never made it. He died in a ship going over there. So we don't have his diary that I'm aware of. And unfortunately, he didn't make it home. So the fort, that's a little side note. Eyre is very interesting. The fort was to serve the men as they constructed the larger fort. So it wasn't meant to be, it was supposed to be put it up, use it, not worry about it. It was made of wood and stone, described as constructed of horizontal timbers with a phrase which extended upward towards its base, and that's that little fringy thing you see around the top. By 1765, it was falling down. They didn't need it anymore. It was falling down. Now, what we don't know is whether there was enough of the buildings that when this became the Army Hospital, the Northern Campaign, if they could use it. We don't know. So, but it was falling down in 65. So let's do some archaeology. And this was fun. This is the first place I ever got to do a dig. It was just, that first place always lives in your heart. So David Starbuck, who is unfortunately passed now, it's a great loss to all of us. He did a dig in 2000 working on the stockaded fort. The foundations for the two barracks are very evident. You can just walk over there and see them now. So he had students. It was a field school where you bring in students and volunteers. And there were very evident stone foundations. And we all got to work on it. Now, when you do an archaeological dig, you never dig 100% of a site. You dig a section of it, and you leave the rest in case somebody in the future has better techniques than you have. So there may well be other artifacts there that David left, but David left them because that's what a good archaeologist does. You do a section, you leave the rest. But we had hundreds of artifacts, incredible artifacts. We have a whole bayonet. We have a lock. We have a lock mechanism. We have a key. We have a two-tined fork. There was a buckles from shoes. There was the frames, not the frames, the latches for windows, the catches for the windows. There was a piece of a strap of a chest, an officer's chest. It actually had a name on it, Armandi. And that is somebody they tracked down who that was. It was a real person. All these artifacts, not all of them, but a good selection of them, trust me, there are boxes of them, are now in the visitor center. If you want to see what I'm talking about, they're there. So the officers' quarters was identified because it had plaster walls. Kind of, the good guys, the big guys get plaster, the other guys get, I guess. But the most unusual thing was there was a structure found in the officers' quarters which appeared to be a gun platform. Really weird. And it wasn't a fireplace base. There was no evidence of any burning on it. But it was that, right here. Square, flat, elevated. right against the wall. Now, why would you have a gun platform in a barracks? I don't know if I can go backwards. Let me try to go back a little bit. If I can get to, no, I want to get to that. Well, and this is what, possibly, gun platform's right there. There's the dock. If you have a fort that you really can't mount cannons in because it's horizontal, it's pretty weak, you have a gun platform in a building, you could put a small gun on that, maybe a swivel cannon on that, and then you can protect your dock. It's very, I don't know. I have no record, nothing that says anything about that. But if you wanted to line up to hit the dock and keep people off of it, it's a perfect place to put it. And that's why I said, remember that barracks is right up against the wall. It's intriguing. We don't know the answer. We'll never know the answer, but it's an intriguing piece of it. Back. So he also did work in further years, attempting to define the walls of the fort. And unfortunately, David was looking for post holes. There were no post holes because it was horizontal logs. But what they did find a room at the west end of the officers' barracks that had a brick floor. It's the only one ever found in any work in the park. We don't know what that room was for. We'll show you a picture. Continue to find numerous artifacts, but he never could find the post holes. And the reason is because there were no post holes. So, and that is the room. Forgive me, it's me. It's me many years ago when I was thinner and I had curly hair. I'm on a talk and it's the best picture I had of it, so forgive me for having used this one. But here, the walls and the brick floor. Was it a storeroom? Did they put their munitions in there? Was it, what was it? We don't know. One of the little sad stories was that the students who excavated this were fairly new, and there was some rocks piled here, and they removed them, and that was the staircase, the stairs going down to the brick room. So they inadvertently took out the stairs down to that room, which is, I won't say what Dr. Starbuck said, but he was a little red in the face. So going into other archaeological techniques, this is okay. This is a LiDAR, a laser. You fly a plane with a laser over the ground and you knock out the trees. You don't see the trees, but you see items on the ground. It's a way down in Central America they find Mayan villages. They do the LiDAR and they see the villages. They cut out all the jungle and they see the villages. Well, here we are. We have a LiDAR of, kind of gets a little distorted, blown up, but here are the two barracks. Here are the other barracks. This is the road around, that little circle road around in the park. And here are the two barracks there. This is a rock pile, and I'm not sure, if you go in there, you'll see that rock pile. I find you can't really see with it blown up, but there's another square over in here that I think deserves archaeological investigation. I'm wondering if it's the location of where one of the hospitals was. So I just think it'd be, if I had my way, if I was an archaeologist, that kind of thing. Yeah. Let me go back. That's the bike trail.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So this bike trail down in there. So it's a little easier when it's blown up like that. You lose the detail. If you looked at it on my screen here, it looks a lot more obvious. It just not really pixelate, but blurs a little bit. And there's our model. and it was done by Rick Conley. I'm sure you know Rick Conley. Just I found him on you find him on Facebook. You know, it was one of these lucky things. I just happened to see something he built on Facebook, and unfortunately, Rick has passed. But he did build this model for us, the stockaded fort, and it's just gorgeous. You can see the 3 bastions, the barracks. This is the officers' barracks. This is the soldiers' barracks. And if you look at this one on, you know the secret now, that there's a gun platform in there, you'll see that he put some different coloration cross thing to close up the area to show where the gun platform was. They would go down to the beach, go down to the, and that's because I said, you got to have something to show the gun platform. So he did a wonderful job. The nice thing about Rick is he actually came up to the park. We walked the park. We looked at it. I gave him everything I had about these, and he really did a great job on it. Now this is my own work, because once I knew that we were looking for horizontal logs on a stone base, I started saying, well, maybe we can see the stone foundation. And what happened was in the springtime, just before Memorial Day, they mowed the lawns differently. And I walked between the 2 barracks, and I looked over here. It's a little hard to say that unless you're there in the park. I said, oh my gosh, that's that bastion. And once you see that, and just because they mowed the grass differently, because I've walked into that park 20 years, I've seen it, and I never saw that bastion until they mowed the grass differently.
Is that next to the King Henrik Memorial on the left of that?
The King Henrik Memorial's over here.
Yes, so
it's over in here someplace. It's quite a ways away from it, but it's there. So, and then so I said, well, can I prove it's the bastion? So I got out a compass, we measuring tapes and the gold maps, and anyways, I did all the calculations, and that comes out to be the only thing it could be is the bastion. So then I started looking for the other pieces, and here is, so again, it's blown up, it's hard, but here is the wall, the west bastion angle. Here is the east wall or the back of it. And you can also see, I don't have a great picture of it, well, actually, it's hard to see, but I do have additional pictures that show one of the other bastions. The stone foundations are there. I just presented that at the annual NISA meeting this year, and they didn't laugh at me.
For 2015, I was actually in part of the dig in 2014 in July, so I'm almost, I love that you guys found that, because we were just finding surface, square nails and, getting in the first couple layers, but.
You weren't one of the students that threw away the stairs, were you?
No. I was a volunteer at the time in 2014, the previous year, but I'm glad you guys continued with that linear system to go excavate the floor.
Yeah, so that was the saddest part about this is that I told David, I said, David, I found the outline of the fort. And unfortunately, David died of cancer, and just before he died, and I never got to bring him down to show him, because it was like, he was so excited that I did it. I said, David, I found it. And unfortunately, he passed. So, I was very lucky. Chuck Bandry was able to get me the DEC drone, and we did a drone flight over the fort. I'll show you another one of the other forts. We did a drone flight. It's my car, the scariest car that's scary. And I laid that outline that I showed you over top the drone picture, and you can see how beautiful. Here's that bastion. This is that angle that I had the picture of. This is that east wall. And the wall is absolutely in here. You can actually see it, but I just didn't put the pictures in. So I think I'm pretty happy that we have identified this stockaded fort in pretty clear.
Is that Fort George Road or Beach Road?
This is the bike trail. This is a bike trail. This is that circle that's in the park.
Okay.
The statue is right there to orient you. In fact, the one frustrating piece of this is I could not find this wall. And I was very frustrated until there's a picture. The statue, the Henry Johnson statue, was dedicated in 1903. And there's a picture of the dedication where they're standing on this side of it with a picture of the statue, the crowds, and in the background is a small pavilion. And I suspect that that pavilion was here, and it obscured that one wall. So I felt I had a reason I couldn't find it. Go ahead.
Is that where the handicap parking sign is in the middle? As you come up around the corner where your cars are, right now, today, there's a handicap parking sign there. Is that?
Could be. I don't know. I couldn't tell you for sure. If you go here, there's a sign, there's signage that tells you this is the stockaded fort. And if you come into the park and you drive past two big parking lots, one on either side, keep going around to a circle. There is a parking area there, and you'll see there's a signage, new signage, and relatively new signage, and tells you about the stockaded fort. Yeah, we put up new signage. In fact, Joanne back there and her husband and I worked very hard to make the new signage go into place. So, it's going this way. The beach is over here to orient you. So the north is something like that. Because this is a certain number of degrees. I can show you all the paper. If you go to the Vic, my paper's in the Vic, and it shows you all the calculations I did.
Where would King Henry's statue be now? And that, roughly?
Right over here.
Over there.
Right here, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's
There's that circle, okay, right in there. Okay? If you go over there, you can see the foundations of the barracks, but be very careful. There's a mode section you can go down. Watch your foot there, but don't go on the buildings because A, they're fragile, but they're also full of poison ivy, and I don't want anyone to get poison ivy on them. I'm really, as a physician, I don't recommend it. Okay, so now let's go to Fort George. Fort George planned to be the largest fort in North America, but just ended up as just a single bastion. So when Amherst came up, as I said, he decided to build the forts before he went north. Unfortunately, he did much better than Abercrombie, because the French at that time, the story is, the French and Indian War here became a world war. And the French and British were at battle in Europe also, as well as in North America. And the French did not have the resources to support both wars, both sections of the war. So the French colonies in North America were being kind of short-shrifted for supplies and men and so forth, because they were all being used in Europe. So the people who were in these French forts really could not mount the type of defense that they could have a year before. So when Amherst was going north, they were blowing up. They blew up Carillon, they blew up Fort St. Frederick, and they headed north because, quite frankly, they didn't have the resources to maintain what they had. So Amherst had a little bit easier time. So when he arrived June 21st of 1759, and he set out right away. I showed you the date of starting the stockaded fort. He had Montresor. They selected the site of the fort. Brazier and, again, Lieutenant Colonel Eyre figured out the plan. They presented the plan to Amherst. And then 2 days later, so the beginning of July, they laid the foundation of the fort. I don't know what that means. I don't know if they went and laid the foundation for the whole fort. If they did, I can't find it, but it could be there. Not only me can't find it, but other people can't find it either, I'm saying. The good thing is the fort, there was lots of limestone, there was lots of clay, although I can't find the clay, but I know it's there. There was all the things necessary to build a stone fort right there on the ground. And in fact, in the park, there are 3 lime kilns. So they were firing the lime kilns, they were making plaster, they were making mortar, There were, there's lots of quarries. So they had everything, and they just started building this stone fort. So from everything, it looks like they focused on the one bastion to begin with. And the walls were thought to be 14 feet thick, so that's pretty big. But Amherst is heading north. The French blow up Fort Carillon. They go up to Fort St. Frederick. They blow the tower in Fort St. Frederick. They head to Canada. Amherst ends up on Crown Point. Strategically, this bastion is a terrible defensive location. It's quite a ways from the water. I'll show you the plan, and you'll see the cannon all faced in the wrong direction, basically. If you can sneak up on this fort easily, because just the way the ground rises, you can crawl up there and they'll never see you. It's just not a good strategic fort. He said, finish the bastion, close it up, come forward. He had laid out His Majesty's Fort, the Crown Point, which is it's still, the huge fort is still there. It did burn, but you can see this huge fort they built up there. Strategically, a better place to control Lake Champlain. Fort George could only do something about the south end of Lake George. This controlled Champlain. Good place. So Fort George was kind of put on minimal, and then finally close it up and finish it. So here was as it was planned. Stockaded fort. This is brazier for Jeffrey Amherst. There's the stockaded fort. He only had one. This is done a plan. And this is what he was going to have Fort George look like. So you see it's a pretty big fort. So here's our soldiers. Robert Webster. He must have been, you can read his much easier. He might have had some more education. June 23rd, this day was the works at the King's Fort, and all our regiment was turned out under arms. A lot of things happening on all hands at work on the hospital, on the King's work, and on the fort. Still at the lake, as our men were at work at the fort. They dug up 7 men's bones that were killed in the siege of Lake George in 1757. I have no idea where they reburied them, but people have been building it, unfortunately finding remains there for some time. So this was what they built. You see a little difference here. Stockaded fort. Now he has 2 barracks there, and there is all they built right there. So you can see this whole huge fort, and you can see if you look here. Here's the lake. Here's this. Strategically, not a good location. A good warehouse, however. There's the plan. This is what looks to the lake. Look at where all the cannon sites are. Great if someone's coming from land, but there's only nothing that really points well down to the lakefront. So not strategically a good place. I'm going to tell you here to think about. These are bomb-proofs. These are rooms in the 14-foot thick wall where you could go to be protected from cannon fire coming in. And I want you to notice this is the barracks. You can see there's not a lot of room in there. This is the barracks. If you note, the barracks are right up against the wall. Archaeologically, we'll show you how that happened. Moving on. I'm doing time. Okay. So 1759, this is all built. They take Quebec. There's no more war in this area. It goes elsewhere. So the fort, all this fort that they built wasn't really very useful. But they kept a small garrison there on Diamond Island between the wars. But in 1775, the Americans got a little frisky. And Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold, on May 10th, decided to take Fort Ticonderoga. 2 days later, Colonel Bernard Romans accepted the surrender of Fort George on May 12th. Now, there's some controversy about who really took Fort George. I'm going with this date because Captain John Norbert, who was a retired British soldier who was stationed there, wrote a long thing about the surrender, and he says on May 12th, he gave the keys to Bernard Romans, and he was treated very nicely. So I figure that the guy who gave the keys says when he gave them, so I'm going to take his word for it. There are lots of stories that other people took the fort earlier. I've done some research on that. There's a story from South Glens Falls. There's a Rev War soldier buried down there who said he took the keys from Fort George in 1775. But I think when you take them all together, Bernard Romans probably picked up a few people to help him, and there really was only a couple people there. You know, Norbert was this old guy who, here's the keys. So that's 1775, so the Americans held it. Now what happens in the Rev War is when Fort Ticonderoga changes hands, so does Fort George. They want that strategic control of Lake George, like I was talking about, the waterway. So British are driven out of Fort Ty, they're driven out of Fort George. 1776, the Americans, 1775, had attempted to take Quebec. They didn't take Quebec, obviously. They were hoping the Canadians were going to come on their side, but they really didn't. And the American soldiers up there got very sick. They got smallpox, they got camp fevers. A lot of people died. They withdrew to Fort Ticonderoga, which was again in American hands. The commandant there said, we got to get these sick people out of here. Half of my men are sick. They sent them down to Fort George, down here. Not to Fort George, because you don't want a bunch of sick people in Fort George, but they sent them down and created the Hospital of the Northern Campaign in the campgrounds around Fort George. I think we don't know where the hospital was. There's some record that shows that it might have been near where Fort William Henry is. But it's likely there were so many of them, they put them any place they could. So probably in the beginning there was just bodies, any place they could find a shelter for them. They were pretty horrible conditions. Some had smallpox, obviously, but others did not. Obviously, they got all these camp illnesses, the bloody fluxes, and all these other things that they had. So that was 1776, and as you know anything about the Cortlandt Street Project, that is very likely the cemetery of the men and people, women, there may be women among them, the people who died from the military hospital, the Northern Campaign. So at least some of them are Revolutionary War soldiers, and that's why you see all the work we've been doing to get them reinterred in the park. 1776, again, Americans. The British came down from Canada, Burgoyne, took over Fort Ticonderoga, came down, took over Fort George. Now, when Burgoyne came down south, he came down the other side, the other part of Lake Champlain. He came down Lake Champlain through Fort Anne. His supply systems came down Lake George and were at Fort George. So Fort George became a supply depot. Now General Schuyler was in charge. And when he heard about this force coming down, he said, abandon Fort George. Take all your supplies and come back south. Don't waste them. Come south. Just get out of there. Wagon loads came south. General Washington was pretty angry about that. And he sent this very sharp letter. You know, there are people who cannot understand why you surrendered, you abandoned this immensely defensible fort. And Schuyler wrote back a letter saying, defensible fort? Have you seen this place? It's falling down. There's no well. You know, yeah, we got some boats here, but we don't have enough to trim them. We don't have sails for them. We can't tar them, you know, of your immensely defensible fort. It's a wonderful letter. And in fact, if you go up the stairs, here at the top of the stairs, you will see an excerpt from that letter. It's really kind of funny. I didn't know that Schuyler was that sarcastic, but he could be. So anyway, so the British used the supply depot when the British were driven out. Failed at the Battle of Saratoga, back in American hands. And then, is this the final hurrah? So the Americans are here. They've got Fort George. British began a fall campaign in 1780 to burn the breadbasket of New York. So the group of them went into the Mohawk Valley, burning anything that belonged to Americans, not the Tories, but the rebels. Carleton came down Champlain, same thing. Took Fort Anne, and then he came near Fort George. They saw people out, some Indians around Fort George. They sent men out there. The men did not realize that Carleton had over 1,000 men with him. Surrounded, killed a lot. Captain Chipman had to surrender Fort George. They were allowed to leave with their belongings, and then the Indians were allowed to go into the fort, take anything they wanted, the spoils of war, and then they burned Fort George. And that was really kind of the end of Fort George. It's still there. I mean, the end of Fort George is a defensive site. So, however, you know, a fort is a fort. There's still good stuff there. And Jared Sparks, who was a minister, an educator, and eventually president of, what's that college in Cambridge. Anyways, I'll think of it in a minute. My brain just shut down. Came around and did all of the American sites that were important in the Revolutionary War. And this is his drawing of Fort George in 1830. So he measured it, and he did the shape of it. One of the pictures I'm going to show you is actually of this corner. It's really cool. It's that corner. So he drew it. The thing that I don't understand is he talks about a causeway. Harvard, he was president of Harvard. See, the brain will, when you get old, you've got a bigger Rolodex and it just takes longer to spin around. So anyways, there was a causeway from Fort George that he described going down to the lake, and I have never seen any archaeology, anything that references that in the later years. So I don't know what it is. That's 1830. Still, it was a really point of interest for people. Here's a stereograph from the mid-1800s of Fort George. People painted it, people stood on it, they would come up there. Fort George was somehow a really important site for them. There it is in 1905, obviously grown up and destroyed. There it is in the early 1920s. I believe this looks out into the parking lot. That's the big parking lot that's there. It's kind of hard to tell. And then in 1921, they did a reconstruction. Accurate? Not sure. But that's what's there now, is this reconstruction of Fort George. And you see it if you drive in that path there. It looks like dirt, is now a paved road, and you can drive by it. So David started doing archaeology. He actually did a dig in 2001 at the mouth of Fort George. But here he is they found these bombs. There were actually rooms under that pile of dirt. There are rooms. That's the bomb-proof. Remember I said the corner? There is the corner that I showed you was in Sparks' drawing. It's right there. Perfect. Remember I said about the barracks? Remember I said that the barracks were right up against the wall? And there they are. This is the wall of the fort. The barracks wall comes right out of it. So the wall of the fort was actually the wall of the barracks too. So it just all fits. I mean, the archaeology proves the history. And there is Rick's model of Fort George. Again, this is also in the Vic. And our LiDAR of Fort George. Again, another thing archaeologists use, and there's the bastion. It does show some interesting things here, but I think this is what we think is the entrenchments from 1757. But again, if there's something that they can use again, they probably did. And it's likely they said, well, they're sitting right here. Why don't we use these stones on the entrenchments as part of the outline of Fort George? Huh? Okay, it's right here.
Oh, so that's
No, right here.
actually like
Right here.
the exterior perimeter of the fort?
Huh?
Is it like the perimeter of the fort?
It's across, here's Fort George, here's the parking lot, here's the road, it's over here. There's an angle, a very lovely angle, and it goes down quite a ways down into there. To come, I'll show you in the fort if you ever want. I'll show you in the park. There's kind of a worn path there now, but it's right across the street from the fort. And there's my last slide, the drone of Fort George. Here's the fort. And there is where the barracks were. It's a pretty cool picture. So I'm showing you some of the techniques that archaeology can show us. I've showed you the history, the archaeology, some other techniques that hopefully we can use more in the future. So I hope you enjoyed this. And for more of the story and to see our curated artifacts, please come down to the Vic. It's really a pretty cool place. Any other questions?
Why did they reconstruct the fort in the 20s so far away from the original fort?
They reconstructed Fort George where it was. Where they reconstructed that wall of Fort George, that is where the fort was. So let me go back. I'll show you. Okay, so if you're, there's two forts, remember. The stockaded fort, this is Fort George. Here is the road where you come in around here, you come in here, there's a big parking lot, that's the parking lot. And that's Fort George. So this is the reconstructed wall right there. Oh. Oh God, don't get me on this. I sat last night trying to figure out, north should be like around here. I was sitting trying to sort that last night as I was naming the walls. So, any other questions? I hope you enjoyed this.